All right, guys, we have a screencast here on the causes of the American Civil War from 1852 to 1859. We're going to kind of leave out Lincoln as much as possible because that's our next lesson, is how the immediate short-term cause of the Civil War will be pointed to Lincoln's election. So we're going to try and focus on Lincoln for a whole lesson. But as we move forward, first thing we want to look at is that about late 1820s, 1830s, there was this thing called the Second Great Awakening. It was a religious movement to push people back into the church, more living a more godly, moral lifestyle. So when you talk morals, you talk about all the things that go with morality. This movement started in Upper New York and in New England. So you're things like temperance, for instance. Let's not drink alcohol. That's not godly. And when you talk not godly, the first thing that jumped into people's minds at that time period was American slavery in the South. And this is when abolition really pushed into the forefront. It was always there, as was in the last screencast with the Quakers. Smaller movement, but this really made it become a mainstream movement, was the Second Great Awakening. That's how Uncle Tom's Cabin comes about. You should know this. Harriet Beecher Stowe, her father, was one of the founders of the Second Great Awakening. So she wrote a book that showed the horrors of slavery. Obviously, this was a big deal. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the bestseller of the time. It was Stephen King and Tom Clancy and Harry Potter all wrapped up in together, and it sold thousands and millions of copies all around the globe. It showed the horrors of slavery, and her entire family was abolitionists. You probably want to write down that her brother was Henry Ward Beecher. He was a preacher that during the Kansas-Nebraska disaster, Bleeding Kansas, collected a bunch of money, bought a bunch of Sharps rifles with them, shipped them out to Kansas under the guise of Bibles. They became known as Beecher's Bibles. Just another little piece of information you can use. But Uncle Tom's Cabin was, in fact, a big deal. Then you have the impending crisis of the South. It was another big deal. Hitting Our Helper was actually a North Carolinian. He was from the South, but he argued that economically slavery sucked for the South, and it was holding the South back. And since it was holding the South back economically, it was holding the country back from being an economic international powerhouse. And that he also argues that the ones that suffer the most from slavery are actually non-slave holding whites, because they're pretty much slaves. They just refuse to call themselves slaves because they're white. This obviously the South hated it, but the North loved it, and we move on with life. Then we have 52 to 53, guys. What to understand is we're going to come across what is the biggest, according to McPherson, if you're using historiography in your essays, according to McPherson, the biggest cause of the Civil War is going to be the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act comes about because everybody wants a transcontinental railroad in the North. They want a transit route from east to west now that we're ocean to ocean. Manifest Destiny is complete. But the big disaster is, where is the terminus going to be, guys? Terminus being stops. Is there going to be a starting and an end point in the South, or a start and end point in the North? So political wrangling begins to get that terminus, because a ton of money is going to come from this. A ton of money, a ton of land, a ton of power, a ton of influence. So this becomes a major sectional issue. The funny thing is, the South doesn't even really care about it. They don't really want it. They never want internal improvements. They don't want to go west. Their whole goal is to get their cotton to the ocean, to places like Charleston. But if this happens, Charleston does not become awesome. Charleston loses its prestige because now you have a railroad. So you got to get that railroad in the South, basically. Even though the South doesn't want it, it becomes another sectional divide. That actually leads to the Gadsden Purchase. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who's from Mississippi at the time, says, yo, we need to get this railroad in the South. He appoints a guy named James Gadsden as minister to Mexico, because even with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Mexican cession, there was still some undisputed land, is what we know as southern New Mexico and southern Arizona. You can Google that, throw a map up, it will make more sense. So Gadsden goes over, and Gadsden actually owns a company in South Carolina called the Canal and Rail Company, but there's a first couple letters, Google it if you need to. He purchases, they negotiate the purchase of a bunch of land, that land I just said, for $10 million. What that does is it increases the possibility for the terminus to be in the South, running from about Alabama, Mississippi area to San Diego. So that is a good thing for the South. And why is that? Well, think of geography. There's not the Rockies there. It's flatter, and it's also already organized, which means Native Americans aren't there either. Or if there are Native Americans, there are regular Americans there to kind of make sure that the building of the railroad will go smoothly. So this actually greatly increases the probability for the terminus to be in the South, and this makes the northern politicians pissed because they want the terminus in the north, and they're more industrial. And the honest truth is, they need it more with their industrialization. The South just wants it to screw the North, and to be perfectly honest. Um, but the problem with any transcontinental railroad in the North, you're going to have to organize territories above the 3630 line of the Missouri Compromise. That creates more free soil. The South cannot abide by that. So that leads to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas-Nebraska Act is obviously going to be what McPherson calls the biggest disaster to lead to the Civil War. That's not everybody. That's historiography you can use in an essay. Stephen Douglas is going to be the champion of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He doesn't care about Kansas-Nebraska. He doesn't necessarily care about slave versus free. He cares about getting a terminus in Chicago. That means all the northern railroads somehow would run to Chicago, and then your transcontinental railroad would run from Chicago to San Francisco. That is a big deal. That's a ton of money for Chicago and Illinois. He wants it there. So he champions that new idea from the Compromise of 1850 called popular sovereignty. Now, that wasn't as big of a deal in 1850 because that territory is all the way the hell out west. But this is to get political support for a northern terminus. He's not even thinking slavery or free. He's thinking get support and not piss anybody off. So his proposal is as such. Split the Nebraska territory into two distinct areas. One, let's keep the North happy. No, no, no. No slavery. It's above 3630. That will be Nebraska. The southern portion, on the other hand, will be decided by the people, that popular sovereignty that you need to know. That's a big deal. It makes the South completely happy, but it contradicts the Missouri Compromise, which pisses off the North. It's endorsed by Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce kind of sucks as a president. And the North does feel betrayed, and this is going to lead to the blow up of the Whig Party. The Whig Party will go bye-bye after Kansas-Nebraska. This is a complete fracturing. This is supposed to please everybody. And at the end of the day, Douglas doesn't think much is going to come of it because Kansas is closer to the North anyway. It's going to become a free state, and at the end of the day, this was what he thought was going to be just political wrangling to get the terminus in Chicago for the Transcontinental Railroad. But as McPherson would say, historiographically, he believes that this is the single biggest thing that will lead to the American Civil War, which does lead to Kansas. So when you talk Kansas, the demographics of it, you have to understand. There were a ton of Northerners. They were mostly pioneers. They're going to go out there and they're going to live. They want to stay there. They want to make this their home. There's actually companies that will send free soilers. They're all going to be free soilers if they're from the North. One is the New England Emigrant Aid Company. They're going to invest in 2,000 abolitionists to go out there and settle, not to just hang out, to settle. Southerners, on the other hand, are mostly squatters. That means they're going to go live there, hang out just to get the state slave. But you're not going to have a lot of slaves because the ones that go up there and squat aren't going to be the rich ones that have slaves from the South. You're not going to uproot your plantation and move 50 slaves up there. You're not going to uproot your home and move 5 slaves there. You're going to hopefully have it as another slave state down the road, which gives you more representation in Congress and gives you more land to farm in the future. It is established by popular sovereignty. That means it's just going to be a disaster. It's just going to be a mad dash to see who can vote this state into existence as slave or free. You have the border ruffians who are pro-slavery Missourians. They cut across the border. They stuff ballot boxes to win elections. They beat people up. That basically makes this whole thing turn into Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas is going to be a pro-slavery government that actually is the legitimate government, but is completely fraudulent because it cheats at every turn to get Kansas to be a pro-slavery state. You will have an anti-slavery government that's kind of illegal, but it's there to make things happen. You have the sacking of Lawrence, which is complete just destruction of Lawrence, the town of Lawrence, which was an anti-slavery settlement. It's a complete destruction of Lawrence, Kansas, just to basically scare off free soilers. Well, then you get retribution for that. It's called the Pottawatomie Massacre. You read about this, hopefully. This is the John Brown. He's kind of bat poop crazy. He thinks he talks to God every single day. and God tells him to murder pro-slavery people. So he goes out, he drags 5 pro-slavery dudes out in the snow in the middle of the night at a pro-slavery settlement called Potawatomi. And instead of just shooting them, I guess that wasn't good enough, he takes broadswords and hacks them to death, making a statement, I guess. Now, also understand there is historiography on John Brown. Some historians will say that this was done in direct retribution for the sacking of Lawrence, and it was also done to protect Lawrence as it was being rebuilt, because John Brown actually does lead a quasi-army, little tiny army, to surround Lawrence as 1,500 border ruffians and soldiers are going to try and attack the place. By the way, the pro-slavery people did attack an armory. They stole a bunch of federal weapons, including cannons, and that's what they are riding to Lawrence with the second time. But nobody really knows about that. So the historiography of John Brown is actually, you could see him as a terrorist, you could see him as the first freedom fighter of the American Civil War, but that's a whole, we could spend an entire lesson of that. We got to move on. At the end of the day, it is a mini Civil War. It's a little tiny Civil War that is going to be a precursor of things to come. So moving on, in addition to Bleeding Kansas, you have what is called Bleeding Sumner. Charles Sumner is a senator from Massachusetts. He is absolutely an abolitionist. And he, of course, is going to be a fiery dude speaking against slavery and especially against Kansas. You have what's called the Crimes Against Kansas speech in 1856. During this speech, he completely insults a South Carolina senator called Andrew Butler. He basically says Andrew Butler's a pimp and slavery's his prostitute. Long story short. Well, you have another South Carolina dude. He's a representative. His cousin's actually Andrew Butler. You have Preston Brooks. He wanders on over, and